Natalie Winters joins us, our White House correspondent. Natalie, you and I have talked now for years about this concept of decoupling versus more integration. Of course, the pressure on President Trump from Wall Street and from the corporatists, and especially Silicon Valley, is more integration. And obviously, the anti-CCP aspect of our movement is we want to decouple. And now that decoupling is kind of, Marco Rubio's there, Waltz is there, some of his advisors. Why is this Taiwan semiconductor deal, how does that play into that? And particularly given this executive order that really didn't get much coverage that happened a week or so ago, ma'am?
Well, it's essentially the same voices, right? Whether it's Wall Street, big business, all these politicians that are compromised by the Chinese Communist Party that we've documented for years, that were telling us that tariffs didn't work. And now all of a sudden you see a huge investment, as you were talking about, $100 billion, 5 factories in Arizona coming from obviously TSMC. But I think that the whole sort of chip semiconductor argumentation that you've always sort of heard come really from the deep state talking point has always been, this is why we need to stay engaged in Ukraine, right? Because we're going to set a bad precedent and we really need Taiwan because of semiconductors, because of these chips, right? The United States economy could potentially crater overnight if China were to ever invade. And I think similar to perhaps President Trump's out of the box, conception of what to do with Gaza, this is another solution to a problem which involves reshoring the American manufacturing, not just to achieve supply chain dominance and security, but to effectively, I think, pull the rug out from under the Chinese Communist Party in terms of negotiating tactics. But I also think the numbers here too, Steve, are just staggering. It's been about 1 month since President Trump has been in office. They've already courted $1.7 trillion in foreign investment. It took the Biden regime 4 years just to get up to $1 trillion. And frankly, a lot of that FDI was riddled in sort of the Hunter Biden, foreign corrupt pay for play. The difference is that I think President Trump represents negotiations not from this, perverse geopolitical equity stance where we have to act like we're not the American hegemon that we are, but that we sort of have a might, an economic might to throw around. And the key difference here, Steve, is that now we're weaponizing our government, our economy, our United States dollar on behalf of the American people instead of against them. And obviously President Trump has staffed his cabinet, his administration with people who are China hawks, who are CCP hawks. And I think for so long, every guest we've ever had on the show, you and I have always sat there. We've seen this sort of performative activism, right, coming from the rhinos who talk so tough on China, how we need to decouple, yet when push comes to shove, right, just like these fiscal hawks who did nothing about the USAID orgy of spending, President Trump actually acts and is working to decouple them by taking this, I think, really, really monumental step in the semiconductor industry, which then, of course, has a lot of trickle-down effects. But this is what decoupling, or at least the opening salvo of it, looks like.
He's balancing this, too, at the same time with this Russian rapprochement that would be the knife in the heart of Beijing's goal to control the Eurasian landmass with the mullahs in Persia. You have two aspects of this, and we're covering, Dave Walsh is going to be on in a second. We're talking about the energy aspect of it and the governmental aspect. We'll also discuss some of the stuff that's going on with NATO and what's happened. But there's another darker side that actually may be more effective, and this is the resistance you've been covering from day one to President Trump. And it has a very dark aspect. In fact, you could say a lot of it started around the color revolution in Ukraine with Victoria Nuland. You've had some great reporting and come up with something that's kind of shocking. Can you walk us through the resistance as a element of the Ukraine fight, and what have you found out about some of the darker aspects of it, ma'am?
Well, I think the Ukraine issue is sort of inextricably linked to the decoupling from the Chinese Communist Party issue that we were just talking about, right? I think the sort of monomania of the idea that Ukraine is the forefront of democracy that sort of plagues the Washington, D.C. class here, it sort of misses the forest for the trees, right? This is about President Trump understanding the geopolitical significance, not just looking at the borders of Ukraine, but understanding that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to bring Russia into their their sphere of influence are certainly more than that, right? And really, I think instigating and instituting a sort of geopolitical alignment, right? The Chinese Communist Party is not content with a unipolar, or rather bipolar world order. They want a unipolar world order whereby they replace the United States, and reorienting kind of global political affairs through that paradigm is what they are trying to do, not just ostensibly with Russia in terms of the Ukraine conflict, but also just by bogging us down in another, shall we say, graveyard of empires, Afghanistan type conflict, right? They would love nothing more than to have the United States peacekeeping forces in Ukraine or anywhere. And, I know you always say you got to focus on the big picture, but, I love drilling down on sort of the minute details. And I don't know if you want to get into it now, but the story about Victoria Nuland's son, who's busy working for a think tank that's actively lobbying against President Trump's peace plan, the proposed mineral deal. He's listed as a researcher contributing to the Center for European Policy Analysis. This shows you how it is not just a family grift, but it really is the Washington consensus, whereby they view these sort of foreign, endless, forever wars as a way. Everyone in the Nuland family makes a paycheck off of killing young American boys and girls in the name of democracy. Literally every single person in that family. And I think that that is quite remarkable because it's replicated time and time again, right? The story of Hunter Biden is not just one incident. That is a pattern that replicates itself, because these people have never been called out. And their business model is one of global collusion with powers at be, like in Ukraine. And they hate the idea of people like President Trump, or frankly, this movement, being able to sort of run the tables on them and say, hey, actually, foreign policy is going to be conducted to benefit the United States of America, and not line your pockets while you're lecturing us with your, monotone voices, your pseudo-intellectualism, and your dysgenic, look, telling us, I guess we have to call her the color revolution dominatrix in honor of Darren Beatty. But that is what represents a transformational shift. And I have to say, Steve, for all the Beltway elites, the think tank, the K Street crowd who think that they're so freaking smart, and that the reason why we need to protect Ukraine and destroy this country and trash our economy is so we set an example so the Chinese Communist Party won't invade Taiwan. Well, here's two things that just happened. President Trump just essentially blocked that by reshoring that industry here to the United States. And two, President Trump is actually showing that the United States actually is someone who's able and willing to negotiate from the standpoint of putting America first, unlike these fake think tank hacks who are quite literally funded by the Chinese Communist Party and their big tech counterparts. So President Trump, as you always say, is a blunt force instrument and an armor-piercing shell. And sometimes it's the thing itself, right? It's the deal, it's the investment, it's the meeting in the Oval Office. But it's also just, I think, more symbolic too, in calling out, I'd call it a grift, maybe racket is a better terminology for it, but the racket that is the incestuous deep state that I think the Nuland family just epitomizes.
And on top of that, you got the geostrategic and geoeconomic. Tonight at midnight, the 25% tariffs go in on two of our three biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada. He says just haven't lived up to being really kind of allies. In addition, I think he's hitting 10% on China tonight. On the morning of, right, his speech is really his first State of the Union, or address to Congress, as it's called, right at the beginning of your first term. Your thoughts on that, ma'am?
Well, look, Steve, all these people who are now telling us that we have to melt down, right, and feel so bad and sympathetic for all these poor people who've been fired by USAID. I'm sorry, those are the same brilliant geniuses who've crafted the policies that have forced President Trump to need to institute these tariffs, crafted the immigration policies that have stolen the jobs, livelihoods, and frankly, dignity by forcing American workers to train their replacements. So I have absolutely zero sympathy, empathy, whatever whatever you want to qualify it as, for these people. And you bring up these tariffs. That's, again, another thing that I think is effectively evaluated through the paradigm of it's not just the thing itself, right? The tariff in and of itself is an effective economic tool, like Peter Navarro has outlined better than I ever could. But I think it also just demonstrates that President Trump, and by extension, the United States, is back. And when they melt down, make no mistake about how President Trump is appointing loyalists, right, the nasty, dirty L word, to his cabinet, they're not melting down because he's appointing people who are loyal to President Trump. They're melting down because he's appointing people who are loyal to the United States of America, because that is so fundamentally transformational, not just from what we've seen under Joe Biden, but really to the existence, the raison d'etre. I don't even like calling it the deep state, but the sort of Washington establishment, beltway class, where they view Canada, these countries that we're now hurling tariffs against, as just trading partners, because you know what? To them, they are. They're, expanded market access, right? It's the trope of when we thought letting China into the WTO that we would change them. It seems like every country, you can extrapolate that critique. Every country that we've somehow gotten into business with, and when I say we, I'm not talking about the American people, right? I'm talking about, the elites, they've benefited, but the average American worker has been totally screwed over. And President Trump is actually fighting for American workers, and that's why they're in meltdown over it. And it's glorious to see.
Natalie, you're going to be with us tomorrow in our wall-to-wall coverage of State of the Union. What is your social media in the interim, ma'am?
Natalie G. Winters on all social media platforms. Look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. Thank you for having me on.
Great hit, Natalie. Thank you so much.